Yep, now we're good.
I thought I pushed that. Okay, let's go.
All right, here we go. Joseph had a dream, and when he told it to his brothers, they hated him all the more. He said to them, "Listen to this dream I had. We were binding sheaves of grain out in the field when suddenly my sheaf rose and stood upright, while your sheaves gathered around mine and bowed down to it." His brothers said to him, "Do you intend to reign over us? Will you actually rule us?" And they hated him all the more because of his dream and what he had said. Then he had another dream, and he told it to his brothers. "Listen," he said, I had another dream, and this time the sun and moon and 11 stars were bowing down to me." When he told his father as well as his brothers, his father rebuked him and said, "What is this dream you had? Will your mother and I and your brothers actually come and bow down to the ground before you?" His brothers were jealous of him, but his father kept the matter in mind.
Eileen?
So when Joseph came to his brothers, they stripped him of his robe, the long robe with sleeves that he wore, and they took him and cast him into a pit. The pit was empty, there was no water in it. Then they sat down to eat, and looking up, they saw a caravan of Ishmaelites coming from Gilead with their camels bearing gum, balm, and myrrh on their way to carry it down to Egypt. When Judah said to his brothers, "What profit is it if we slay our brother and conceal his blood? Come, let us sell him to the Ishmaelites, and let none of our hands be upon him. For he is our brother, our own flesh." And his brothers heeded him. Then Midianite traders passed by, and they drew Joseph up and lifted him out of the pit and sold him to the Ishmaelites for 20 shekel of silver, and they took Joseph to Egypt.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Eileen. And welcome, Sandy. Sandy and Dave.
Right.
Welcome.
Our friend came over to get rid of a wasp nest.
Oh, that's fun.
Yeah. We really just got started, and we read the scriptures that pertain to today, which are really overlap in great deal to what we read last week from chapter 37. I'm going to ask Pastor Scott if he can, at this point, play the video for us, and then we'll come back and revisit some of that maybe, and maybe go a couple of different directions.
Okay. Can you guys see it?
Yes, sir.
Yes.
All right, so
We have video.
we are good.
No, we haven't heard it yet.
Can you hear it now?
Well, don't hold me to the details of this childhood memory. I can't remember exactly how old I was. I really can't remember where the birthday party was. Judging from the neighborhood we were living in, I may have been 4th or 5th grade. Don't really even remember who was at the party. But what I'll never forget was Bozo the bounce back clown. I mean, you can imagine a bunch of 9 or 10-year-olds. We came at him and we kicked him and we punched him. We did our best to level the clown, but he kept bouncing back up. No matter how hard you hit him, no matter how you tried to hit him, he just kept bouncing back up. How did he do that? I mean, he was a clown, for crying out loud, full of air. But no matter what we did, he just seemed to be able to snap right back up on his feet. We would do well to learn his secret, wouldn't we? Life comes at us with a flurry of flying fists. We get knocked down, we get beat up, we get shoved around. And some people never get back up. Some people, once they're down, they just stay down. But Joseph, the guy was a walking piñata. Everybody took a shot at him, but every time they did, he just bounced right up. He just bounced right up. What was his secret? You know, I've come to learn that Bozo, the bounce back clown, and Joseph, well, they have something in common. That bounce back clown, I came to learn, has a ballast in it, a 3-pound bag of sand buried deep down within it, and it serves as an anchor, helps it get back up. Joseph had something similar. a deep-seated trust in the sovereignty and the goodness of God. Do you have this anchor for your life? Would you like to learn how to get one? Well, if you have a pulse, then likely you have a problem. It just comes with life. Challenges come, struggles come. And sometimes we wonder, am I going to get through this one? This one seems awfully tough. The challenge is awfully steep. The demands are too many. I think the reason that the story of Joseph is in the Bible is to show us God gets us through tough times and to show us how He uses tough times for His glory and our development. I'd like to invite you to state this simple creed that we've crafted. Fill your lungs with air and your hearts with hope. Let's say it together, shall we? I'll get through this. It won't be painless. It won't be quick. But God will use this mess for good. In the meantime, don't be foolish or naive, but don't despair either. With God's help, I will get through this. Now, if you know the story of Joseph, you know that really his problems began when his mouth did. He came one day to his brothers and told them about these dreams that he had had. These dreams in which basically they're all bowing down to him. He's kind of the big one, they're the small ones, and they're the ones who are bowing down to him. Now, I don't know what he thought. I don't know, did he think his brothers were going to be excited about this? Did he think, oh boy, they're just going to be so happy to say, okay, we'll bow down before you, baby brother, any day of the week. But they were not excited. Nobody liked the idea. And so the brothers, when they had the opportunity to silence Joseph once and for all, they took it. They took it. 60 miles away from home, far away from Daddy, who had a way of pampering and protecting little Joseph, they took their brother and they dumped him over the edge of a pit. And really, that's where his story begins, in a pit. Not a glamorous place for a story to begin. He's only a teenage boy, about 17 years of age. And we get the impression that it was the intention of the brothers really to kill him. They would have let him die. They had a plan of how they were going to put blood on that multicolored coat and present it to their dad. And as far as they were concerned, they were going to let him die, or he came for them to sell him into slavery. Now, can you imagine if you're Joseph down at the bottom of the pit and you hear your brother starting to carry on a conversation with a bunch of foreigners, and you recognize there's some kind of negotiation is going on here. Hey, we'll give you 10 coins for him. Oh, no, we've got to have more than that. No less than 30. 15, no more. 25, 20, that's our final offer. And they settle. And somebody is lowered down into the pit on a rope, and they grab a hold of you, and they're pulled up out of the pit, and you are stood in front of these traders, these foreigners, and they examine you, and they say, all right, you're ours. And they walk you over and they tie you up in between a bunch of camels to the back of a wagon, and they start leading you away, and you look up and your brothers are disappearing over the horizon. And you yell for them to come back and help you. But nobody turns. Nobody turns. And all of a sudden you realize your life will never be the same again. The way the Bible describes this is in Genesis 37 and verse 28. Just a short passage. It says, his brothers sold him for 20 pieces of silver to the Ishmaelites, who took Joseph with them down to Egypt. Down to Egypt. Just a few hours ago, his life had been looking up. Had that nice coat. He was coming to get his brothers, sent there by his father on a special errand. Everything was looking up. Everyone was supposed to, in his dreams, look up to him. His brothers were supposed to look up to him. His parents were supposed to look up to him. I mean, everything was looking up. But boy, have you ever noticed how everything can go down? What goes up goes down. And Joseph's life did. He was put down by his siblings, thrown down into an empty well, let down by his brothers, sold down the river as a slave, and now he is led down the road to Egypt. Down, down, down. Life has a way of letting us down. Just like that, everything that Joseph thought would happen did not happen, and the worst that he could imagine happening did happen, just like that. Maybe just like you. Maybe you've been down the road, down to Egypt, down to the unemployment line, down to the divorce court, down to the bottom of the pecking order, down, down, down. You know, Joseph arrived in Egypt with nothing. Think about it. Nothing. Not a penny to his name, and not a name worth a penny. I mean, he didn't have anything. He didn't have any credentials to stand on. Nobody in Egypt cared that he was the great-grandson of Abraham. I mean, Egypt was New York City. And Joseph, he was from the country. He didn't have anything to stand on. In fact, the Bible will teach us later that the Egyptians actually looked down on the shepherds. They didn't like to intermingle with them. They were the people of the pyramids and the people of the pasture. Well, that was a lower class. Joseph didn't have anything. And yet he not only survived, but he thrived. And one of the best questions we can ask is this: how do we explain Joseph's survival? How do we explain his success? Have you ever noticed the Bible says nothing about his education, nothing about his training, nothing about his skills, nothing about his talents? Doesn't say anything about this. But all the Bible gives us when it comes to Joseph going into Egypt, all the Bible gives us are these mysterious dreams. These dreams. You see, these dreams were more to Joseph than just images in the night. Something about these dreams convinced Joseph that God had a plan for him. All Joseph had when he arrived in Egypt was this sense of God's hand upon him, that God had a special place for him. God had a special use for him. That's all Joseph had. And in the end, that's all Joseph needed. The word we use to describe a gift like this is destiny. Destiny. Joseph had a sense of destiny to his life. I can just picture him as he's being led across the desert thinking, okay, there's more to my life than this. God has told me. As he's being sold into slavery, he would think, there's more to my life than this. God has told me. He had a sense of destiny to his life. I'd like to talk to you about your destiny. Do you have a sense of destiny in your life? You know, I'm entering my 3rd decade as a pastor. I know I don't look that old, but I've been doing this a long time. Not as old as some of my friends, but I've been doing it a long, long time. And you know, 30 years as a pastor, I've heard many, many people tell me how they have been taken down the road to Egypt in their own versions, their own challenges, their own calamities. And through the years, I've learned a great question to ask anyone who is passing through a time like this. And if you and I were having this discussion, after you had told me how life had been taking you down the road to Egypt, at a certain point, I would say this. I want to ask you a question. What is the one thing you still have that no one can take? What is the one thing you still have that no one can take? No one diminishes the fact, my friend, that life takes much from us. Life takes opportunities. Life takes our health. Sometimes life takes our loved ones and our friends. But this is a good question. What is the one gift, the one element of your life that no one can touch? The answer to that question is God's destiny. No one can touch it. They can take a lot of things from you. And life does take a lot of things. But no one can take your destiny. Now, destinies come to us in a variety of ways, depending upon our skills, upon our talents, upon our history. But there are a couple of common denominators to all of our destinies. Number one, you are God's child. You are God's child. Before you're a butler, a baker, or a cabinet maker, you're God's child. Before you're male or female or Asian or Hispanic, you are God's child. This means He chose you. He purchased you. He laid claim to you. He said, I want you to be a part of my eternal kingdom. Listen, nobody can take that from you. Yeah, they can take your job, might take your hair, but nobody can take away this simple truth. And you got to hang on to it like the parachute that it is. You are God's child. Jesus said, you didn't choose me, I chose you. What does that mean? That means He examined your life from beginning to end, from birth to hearse. He saw every decision, good or bad, you were going to make, and He said, I want that child in my kingdom. You are His first choice. You're not His second choice. He doesn't have to choose you. He chose to choose you. I remember one time I was conducting a wedding, performing a wedding, and right before I went out with the groom to conduct a wedding ceremony, I don't know what inspired him to tell me this, but he leaned over to me and he said, Pastor, I just wanted to tell you, you weren't my first choice. I said, I wasn't. He said, no, the guy I wanted to do this couldn't be here, so thanks for filling in. I said, well, thanks. So we went out and, and did the wedding. Listen, God's never going to say that to you. You were His first choice. He placed you on this planet in this generation with these skills in the place where you live for a purpose, for a reason. You are His first choice. You are His child. You got to hang on to that. You are His child. That's part of your destiny. And not only are you His child, you are His child forever. You are His child forever. You are His child, but for all eternity. Don't believe the tombstone. The tombstone says you started at this date and you'll end at this date. And in between, you're just a tiny dash. But according to God, you are His child forever. I love this verse from the Apostle Paul. He says, when this tent we live in, our body here on earth is torn down, God will have a house in heaven for us to live in, a home He Himself has made, which will last forever. So don't get sucked into this short-term thinking. God has a great plan for you. This destiny means that God's greatest for you lies ahead of you. God's greatest plans for you are literally out of this world. They're out of this life. They're in the next life. And everything in this life is working together to prepare us for what lies ahead. This is God's destiny. Nobody can take this from you. Now, you'll be led down the road to Egypt in some ways that you and I probably can't imagine at this point. But you got to hang on to your destiny. My dad was taken down the road to Egypt, not by slave traders, but really by bad health. I wish you could have met my dad. the most humble, really a simple he was a mechanic in West Texas. And he didn't have a lot of great dreams in life. He was a great dad, great husband, a very reliable worker, worked for the same company for over 30 years. But he had this dream of retiring and buying a travel trailer and visiting every national park in America. If you'd asked him, what's your fondest dream? He said, I want to pull my travel trailer to every national park in America. Well, he retired. I think he was about 65 or 66, and within a year, he had taken his savings and bought that travel trailer, and he and Mom went out for about a year, and they began visiting different national parks. They were just having the time of their lives. Somewhere on one of the trips, Dad began to notice that he was losing the mobility in his hand. Again, a mechanic, he could fix anything, and he got to the point where he couldn't hold a screwdriver. And soon he was diagnosed with a degenerative muscular disease, ALS, it's called. Lou Gehrig's disease is commonly referred to. It's a cruel disease in which the body literally loses its ability to function. And so here he was. His only dream had been to travel around the country, and here he is, taken down to Egypt, so to speak. It was disappointing to him. My wife and I were living in Miami, Florida at the time. I was in my mid-20s, and I was preparing to move to South America to be a missionary in Brazil. But when my father's disease was diagnosed, I wrote him a letter. I couldn't move to Brazil, at least I didn't think so. I couldn't move to Brazil knowing my dad had a terminal illness. Again, this is before email. This is back in the days of real letters. And so I wrote my dad a letter, and I said, Dad, I don't think I should go to Brazil. Well, Dad wrote me a letter back. And I've kept it all these years. He was a man who would write short notes. This was a 4-page letter, And I carried this letter in my Bible for many, many years. Now I keep it safely protected. I don't carry it anymore for fear it'll fall apart. But listen to this paragraph. Here's a dying man writing this paragraph. He says, Max, in regards to my disease, and you're going to Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, that is really an easy answer for me, and that is go. That should be all that is necessary. But I do want you to know this. I must say to you that I have no fear of death or eternity. So don't be concerned about me. You go and please Him. Now, who can write a letter like that? I think a Joseph can. Somebody who has received the destiny that God has in store for them. Somebody who believes that the best of life is coming in the next life. Somebody who believes that God is still on the throne. Somebody who believes that they are God's child and that they are God's child forever. And yes, life takes us to Egypt every so often. And sometimes it just seems like the trip will never end. But because he embraced his destiny, he could face the difficulty with courage. It works like this. Let's say your company is laying off employees. And finally your boss calls you into his office. He does his best, to let you down easy, but a layoff is a layoff. And so you begin that long walk back to your office and you begin cleaning out your desk. And all of a sudden these thoughts of fear and anxiety start climbing into your brain. How am I going to pay my mortgage? How am I going to take care of my kids? Where am I going to find a job? And at that moment, you're being led down to Egypt, aren't you? But then you remember, it's not easy. You got to decide to do it. But then you say, okay, no, I'm going to remember my destiny. They may take my job, but I'm still God's child. And I may pass through a tough season, but you know what? I'm His for eternity. He's still on the throne. And all of a sudden, you begin to feel just a little bit of courage. And your back straightens and you kind of stand up a little bit and bingo, You know, the devil didn't get you because you trusted your destiny. Or what about this one? Let's say your fiance calls you and he wants his ring back. The jerk, the bum, no good pond scum. Ever since he saw that new lady at the office, you know, all those promises, all those dreams. And then you just, you know, you can feel the anger. You can feel your jaw tighten. You begin to plot how you're going to get back at him. You know, you're just going to write off men forever. And just all of these thoughts start coming in. But then you think, yeah, but wait, what do I still have? What do I still have that no one can take? That no one can take. You know what? I'm still a daughter of God. I'm still a child of God. He bought me. He died for me. He claimed me. And I'm not just his child for a week. He won't break this promise like that guy did. He's made a covenant with me. And I'm going to hang on to it. And I'm going to listen to the voice of destiny. I really think Joseph must have done this. Because when he arrived in Egypt, he didn't have anything else. He didn't have anything else. He didn't have a penny. He didn't have any clothing. He didn't have any friends. He didn't have any clout. But it was just a matter of time before God took all that was intended for evil and turned it into something good. And he could do this in Joseph's life because Joseph trusted the destiny that God had for him. And I pray that you and I will do the same.
Welcome back, everybody. I forgot I had muted myself. Just a reminder, we are recording this. I don't know. What do you do with it, Pastor Scott?
I put it on our YouTube channel
Okay,
for
thanks.
people to view.
Okay.
Yeah. Mhm.
So what do you have, having watched the video, before I take us through something else, what did you notice? What did you grab onto? What made all kinds of sense? Did anything make you go, you know?
I like that, did he call it a mantra that they all said in the beginning? I was trying to write down what I could see in the background because I want to share that with my friend who has COVID right now, I think. But I couldn't get it all. I don't know if that's available in your book.
I will double check and see what I can do for you, Lynn.
Okay, thank you. But I thought that was perfect for our time too.
Mhm.
Might be in the study guide. I'm going to take a look at the study guide here.
I will. I can't believe it's not in the text somewhere. I
I'm
just
sure
don't
it's in
remember
there.
specifically reading that. So I will check. I will look. I will find it because before we're done, I'll read the book. So
I got this much of it. I'll get through this. It won't be painless. It won't be quick, but God will use this mess for good. And something about in the meantime, and then I lost it.
I can't help you fill it in specifically. So
Okay. I'm just trying to get what I can find here so far.
So
I found it.
have you been down? Did you say you found it?
Yeah, I found it.
Well, go ahead and read it then. So
Okay, you ready?
Mm-hmm.
You'll get through this. It won't be painless. It won't be quick. But God will use this mess for good. In the meantime, don't be foolish or naive. But don't despair either. With God's help, you will get through this.
Don't be foolish. Don't be foolish or naive.
Yep.
And that what was the next?
But don't despair either.
think, okay,
And then it's with God's help, you will get through this.
thank you.
You're welcome. That's it.
So does this image of an Egypt road make sense to everybody?
I think so.
Mhm.
Okay.
I think sometimes what happens, and we've all gone through it, so, but that your emotions come up before you can learn to control. You know, you walk into an office and we can't use your talent anymore. And the emotions come up first before the conscious thinking of God is always with me.
Well, there's the immediate too. I'm sure most of you have heard this phrase that the immediate takes precedence over the important.
Oh, okay.
Makes sense.
I mean, it's something that's a kind of a management, thing that went around for a while. It was to, pay attention to the important things. But if you look at what would happen during any day at work, sometimes at home, right? The immediate takes precedence. Fixing that spouting faucet really wasn't the most important thing to do today until it started spewing water all over the kitchen.
Oh, dear.
Now that might be a good example of the immediate becoming the important, but the point is, doesn't matter what other important things you had on the list, the immediate one jumps to the front. And that often, that's a part of going down these roads, is that we get very short term. We thinking only in the immediate. That's kind of one of the things that is culturally more difficult today, because everything is so quick. I mean, he made the quip in the video about this was back in the days before emails. You had to write a real letter. You had to send a real note. Well, we're just so used to the immediate, and the things happen so quick, and it's made us often short term in thought. I mean, even all the conversations about when and how and what should open in our culture today.
Right.
I understand there's all kinds of levels of opinion and conviction and feeling and thought, but the one thing that strikes me so often at every level, including the politician level, but certainly the people, is that sometimes we're a little short-term thought. We're thinking about what's good for us now, this week, next week, but what will be good for us 2 months from now? What will make this better 1 year from now? The people, for a while there was talk about the historical precedents for this. The best that we could do was the Spanish flu of about 100 years ago. I don't have these numbers exactly right because I'm just remembering my reading. But the first round of the Spanish flu killed like 3 million people in the United States.
Oh.
A year later, when it came back, it killed 50 million.
Wow.
Oh.
Yeah.
I didn't know that.
I remember reading something like that, Kevin. Yeah.
That might be more of a worldwide number than the United States. But either way, the point is
People.
that it was all but 20%, 20 times as deadly on the rebound. So I don't know how much attention to that we need to pay today, but if we're not at least giving that a sideways glance, then we're being pretty short-sighted.
Yeah.
And you got to be careful of that and be leery of that. That occurred to me watching the video, the short-sightedness and the short-termness. I thought of a little illustration, another Benjamin story for you. He and I have been playing chess for years, and he's pretty good actually, and he does on occasion win. And what you do know is Uncle Kevin doesn't let him win, because what good is that when he finally beats me for real? I mean, the day he beat me the first time was just fun, but last summer we were playing one day, and I made a huge mistake. And he sat on the other end of the board looking at that, then he looked at me, and he looked at that, and he looked at me. He knew that he could take my queen. But what he couldn't figure out was what was going to happen when he did it. He was convinced that I was sacrificing to get him. And he sat and he looked and he sat and he looked and he looked at me and he looked at the board and he looked at me, and finally I looked at him and I said, "You know, Ben, everybody makes mistakes." And he said, "Really?" And I said, "Yeah." And he said, "Okay," and he took it. But he was convinced to show his wisdom that this was going to be short-term gain, and he was going to lose the game very quickly. He just didn't know how. And he wouldn't have taken, I don't believe he would have taken it if I hadn't said that to him. Because he was convinced he was missing something. And he understood that in the game, you can't trade short-term for necessarily, because you might lose the game doing that. And that came back to me that as a culture, we're so short-sighted. You know, we're so short-sighted about immediate, because we're used to everything being immediate. It just is. You know, if I really wanted to research something in my youth, what did I have to do?
Get the
Our
encyclopedia.
catalog.
Go to the
Card
library.
catalog. Go to the library.
We went to the library and
Yeah.
we went through files and
What do you do? What do you do today?
go on the internet.
You type it in Google, right? Ask Siri, ask Alexa. And it comes right back. So one of the parts of this that is a lesson for us is the immediacy, it seems.
I was thinking about the email. I think there are disadvantages to the email.
Sure.
If you wanted to, because I treasure some letters that my mother and dad wrote me, because letters express feelings compared to the internet. And the other thing is that email. And the other thing is, it seems like people are losing their jobs through email.
Well,
But a person, your boss can't confront you and say, no, we have to downsize, or you don't have the gifts that we needed for this job. And why not be brave enough and have the courage to face your employee and say that?
yeah, there's a truth to that.
They want to do the immediate. They want to
Well,
do the emails, so I don't have to look at your feelings or what's going on.
well, yeah. Also occurs to me, when you do get something that our house, we call it real mail. That's mail that isn't like bulk rate or a solicitation or a bill. Okay, real mail. Don't you look at the envelope and go, I know that writing.
Yes.
Have you ever looked at your computer and go, I know that typing?
Yeah.
I mean, there is that. There is that, sense of that. And so anyway, well, Max spent a nice amount of time talking about this whole idea of divine destiny. I have to admit, I'm not a big fan of the word destiny there in lots of cases. Maybe that's that non-Calvinist portion of me doesn't really like that so much. But
Sounds like it.
as he was talking about it, I thought, but if I start thinking about that as God's love, God's presence, God's eternal life, God's ultimate hope, those are also very enlightening and all of that. But how do we access that? How do we connect to that? How do we get to open ourselves up to God's divine presence? And there's some things that we can do with that. And the text, the book, lays those out a little. The first lays them out a lot. The first is to lay claim to the nearness of God. You know, to
Yeah.
make sure we connect with God's near. We don't always feel that, but it's kind of like the couple that went to marriage counseling, and the counselor asked the wife, "Well, how would you describe the problem?" He says, "Well, you know, it seems so distant anymore. Like, well, when we used to ride in the car, he used to always put his arm around me." And her husband looked over and said, "The steering wheel's in the same place." She quit sitting in the middle of the seat.
Oh,
Now we all have bucket seats, or most of us, right? You know, right? You know, she quit sitting in the middle of the seat. Who became distant?
Right?
Who started the distancing? Now, of course, you know, in our world today, we're all talking social distancing, but you know, we move away from God. We move ourselves away from God, or at least we move ourselves less closely to God, and that's something to pay attention to. That, you know, we can hold on to that stuff that keeps us near to God, allows us to remember that. You know, think about how and when you've experienced God's closeness. You know, that's the time to dig in on that. That's the kind of double down on that in terms of being close to God. Not saying, well, I'm not feeling close to God, so, gee, I think I won't read my Bible today. Gee, I won't pray today. Well, you know, that's actually adding to that dilemma. One of the lines in Max, the book, the text, Max writes, "Difficult days demand decisions of faith." You know, you got to act on the faith. You got to act on your faith on the difficult days. So
It's funny, I just got a message from Marlis, who has the COVID, and she said, "Thanks for sharing. I need to focus on truth, not on my circumstances."
yes, well, yeah, a decision of faith. Yep, absolutely. The next thing Max encourages us to do is to hold on to God's character, to cling to God's character. And if you think about how you describe God, how would you describe God? To hang on to that character in difficult times. So how would you describe God? What is God's character?
Well, God is love.
Okay. Yeah, cherry pick the easy one, Pastor Scott. You know.
Sure.
always there,
I'm sorry, what?
always there.
All right, always there.
All
God
know.
is peace.
There's peace, there's calm.
Mhm.
I was thinking all-knowing, great wisdom, you know.
What wise wisdom? I don't know that you would think of this as character, but it's a characteristic of God. It's a huge deal. God doesn't change.
True.
Yeah.
In a culture and in a world, a society where change is at warp speed, to know and to be able to plant yourself on God who doesn't change is huge. Absolutely huge. You know, there are promises of God, there are things of God you can count on because God isn't going to change. Priorities won't change, direction won't change. Won't change. Any other characteristics of God you want to lift up? Another way to keep ourselves near to God and to really connect to God's presence is pray out your pain. You know, what is it that's going on in your life you can't tell God? What is it that's too painful to share with God? Does God not already know that this is painful?
Yeah.
Does God already not know that this is painful to you?
But sometimes it's good to express it.
Absolutely. That's why you have to do that.
And then you hear it back and you say, okay, he understands.
Yes. And in speaking, it becomes real. And that real is a couple of ways. It becomes real because we've given voice to it, but it also allows us to bring it down in size because it's real now. Sometimes the problems you talk about, once you've talked about them, you go, yeah, that's not exactly quite so big. And I think that applies to all kinds of things. I think it applies sometimes in a work life, maybe an engineering problem or a design problem. And you start talking about it with a person or two, maybe even just talking about it to yourself. And the next thing you know, not so big a deal. I mean, mechanics. I've heard mechanics standing in their garage over the engine, talking to themselves. I think they're whittling the problem down, and doing stuff like that. And it's important. It allows us to find encouragement. It allows us to find support from God, but it also might be with somebody else. Talk it out with someone else. Share it with someone else. The benefits of sharing it, of saying it. Once you say it, you kind of own it rather than the fear or the pain owning you. I mean, you ever dealt with a child who thought there was a monster in the closet or under their bed? Seems to me the best thing to do is to open the closet door and play around in there for a while. Look under the bed, crawl under the bed. Is there really something there? But as long as you just let it to the imagination, it's a big deal, isn't it?
Yeah.
So, there's something to be said for, praying it, let God speak comfort to it and hope, let it out there, because then it's dealable. Then you can do something with it. Then you can, and a part of that is to lean on God's people. You might not want to lean on everybody. You might not want to share it as a prayer concern to your whole congregation, but there's got to be some people. There's just got to be some people. I've been blessed for almost my entire ministry to have this little cadre of people who, when I really needed something prayed about that was about me, it might be in the church, but really about me, that's who I call. Right. That's who I talk to. And some of those people now go back 35 years. Yeah, boy, do I hate to admit that. Almost 35 years. And some of them I've lost, they've gone on. But, that's important to be able to share that and to lean on somebody and to be able to trust that, And yeah, some of those is, beyond and some of that comes down to interacting beyond the cursory. People say to you, how you doing? You always say fine, right?
Right.
On a really bad day, you say okay. And you try not to frown while you say it. Now, exactly what good did that do us? It didn't do you any good, or me. I'll play the guy who says it. Doesn't do me any good. And there really was no benefit to the person who asked. Right. Now, sometimes there's people that don't really want to know. Probably there's a pretty good chance that if the cashier happens to say, so how are you today? They don't really care.
Right.
They should learn not to ask, but that's another story. But, especially within the community of faith or how are you? You ought to be able to say so. Or at least to some level. And that's a way of staying in connection with God, because those people in ways represent God in our lives, in our world. I mean, in some respects, isn't that one of the problems here with the Joseph story? They aren't God to each other. They're set up in a much different way. They're in almost in opposition. And so they can't be that for each other. Joseph's brothers aren't in a spot where they feel like they can go to Joseph or even to their father and say, you know, this comes across as really unfair and it's creating a level of bitterness. I don't know.
I don't think they would have done that in that day and age.
No.
Maybe in today's, they might have, but I don't think in those days they would have.
Well, I don't know. Yeah, things were different. They probably wouldn't have go after Dad. But, you know, at some point, I wonder what would have happened if one of the brothers would have just said to Joseph, you know, because they're older than he is. Culture says they should pay attention. He should pay attention to him. He said, look, we know that you're special to Dad. We'll cope with that. But we don't need you grinding our nose into the mud. We don't need you grinding our nose into it. It's a fact. We live with it. It's okay. But I don't need to take your grief and your guff about it. I don't need to take your crap about it. So, you know, if you can't say something appropriate, just shut up, Joseph. You know? But that never happens, and so they get to the point where it just blows over.
So what do you think he was thinking when he was telling these brothers about this, you know, dream? Do you think he was being boastful, or do you think he was just being kind of like, you know, is it true, or?
Yeah,
Matter of fact.
Yeah.
Yeah, fact. Yeah, but
All a dream.
I mean, he kind of was
Yeah.
like putting it in their face a little bit. You know what
Well,
I mean?
Yeah, I'd be shocked to find out this was his first dream.
Yeah.
I'd be shocked, and I'd be shocked to find out this is his first dream that has some meaning like this. It's hard to tell. I can't put myself into that one. I could preach a sermon, probably go in either direction.
Yeah, because he could have been perfectly innocent about it, or it could have been.
But at 17 years of age, I mean, he's basically an adult.
Oh, in their world,
Back
absolutely.
in those days, and
Absolutely.
yeah, it'd be interesting to know what his approach would be and how he's telling that. Like, if they've been picking on him every day and that, he could say, "Hey, listen to this. Look at the dream I had about you guys."
If you
Or-
were,
I'm going to be top dog.
Yeah.
If you're going to try to ask me to pin it down, I would say the biggest clue comes from how his brothers react.
Yeah.
Yeah.
If he was normally an easygoing, nice guy, they might have been like, "Oh, come on, Joseph, what are you doing here?"
Yeah.
But they go way out in a big hurry.
Mm-hmm. Like
So-
they had.
Well, except for the brother Reuben. Didn't Reuben somewhat try to appease the other brothers to not, let's not do this to the guy.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's Reuben. And then later in today we read the piece where Judah says, "Hey, let's just send them off to Egypt."
Yeah.
So, but yes, I think that's the biggest clue that we can take out of who Joseph was, maybe what his character was. The biggest clue we can take is from his brothers.
Well, yeah, and I mean, growing up in a house where the was obviously favoring him, that must have been annoying, if nothing else, to the
Sure.
other.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And, you know, but again, at this point, Joseph's not that young. He's older. If we think he's anything in his teens, he qualifies as an adult male in the society. And at this point, they kind of go, "That's him." You know, that's him.
But then they later find out who he truly is.
Well, but is that who Joseph truly is? Or do these circumstances make Joseph that?
Well, he definitely matured during that period of time while they were away from him, and
Yeah.
So
I mean,
that's a huge part of, you know, he still had his roots, so to speak, but after living in Egypt all that time, he saw a lot of things that he probably didn't care for. He probably wished he could be back with his family, I'm sure, over time, wondering how they are. You think
Right.
about how long that time was that he was away, and he didn't know that his father thought he was dead.
Right.
right. So, yeah, I mean, from the cistern to the long journey, he's a slave to the Midianites. He's works for Potiphar, and then he winds up in prison again. And interestingly enough, the dreams that got him in trouble at home get him out of trouble in Egypt.
Right.
So, there's a lot of interesting things in the biblical stories and accounts. But, but here he is. I think he becomes a different person.
Yeah.
And that's true of any of us, and it's a good thing, because if we're not paying attention to learn, that's really sad, right? I think he does become a different person through it all, because you really don't get much of the braggart kind of person later on in the story.
No.
I mean, I don't remember seeing that surface anywhere. As I remember the story a little bit, I've read it, look at it ahead here. I don't see that.
And we're getting a snapshot. I always say that,
Absolutely.
You know that. So we're getting a snapshot of his life, and this has been years, right? I mean,
Yeah.
I forget how many years it was, but yeah, it's not just like 2 years or something like that. It's more.
No,
it's more than that.
Yeah, it's a good number of time, and it is. We don't get all the details. I mean, we couldn't stand to carry a Bible if we had all the details. It would be too big. But there are so many times where I go, oh, I just wish I had the details on this story, But we don't. So, so here's Joseph with all these things, and we're going to talk about some more of them, I suspect. But starting with this whole idea of being thrown in the cistern, being sold into slavery, can you try to imagine what's Joseph thinking?
Yeah.
What's he thinking as this is unfolding in the immediate, in the now? I mean, oh man.
I bet is he going to die? He probably thought he was going to die when he was thrown in the cistern, and then he was probably slightly relieved when he was pulled out. At least he wasn't going to die in the well or the cistern. But then he's being sold, basically, you know what I mean, into slavery, and who knows?
That's right.
That word that Max used, destiny, I wonder how many times Joseph would have thought, oh, is this my destiny? And then a few days later, oh, is this my destiny? And then a year later, oh, is this my destiny?
Well, yeah, because it does sort of keep changing, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Yep. So I don't know that Joseph would have been thinking about these phrases, but there really are the things that, for us, if we're looking for a takeaway from this, Psalm 139:7 says, "Where can I go to get away from your spirit? Where can I run from you?" In Acts, we're reminded He is not far from each of us. The idea that God is always here. Joseph had to remind himself of that if he got to thinking that, because he's in a down time. He's in a down place. But God is here. You'll get through it. Might not be easy. Might not be the way you'd like. Might not be in a hurry. But you will get through it.
Would he have been taught what was he, an Israelite?
Oh yeah.
And so he would have been taught some of the Jewish law?
No, that's way back at the beginning. Nothing's written down at this point.
Okay.
It would have been word of mouth. I mean, Joseph's the great-grandson of Abraham.
Okay. So it would have been word of mouth.
Yeah, it would have been oral culture.
Okay,
It would have been all oral culture. Not even Psalms are written at this point.
okay. Well, I just was wondering what kind of faith he would have had to think about God. But
Well, God is the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Jacob's his daddy.
that's true. That is true.
So-
Jacob had that dream, right? You know, he had that dream where like the stairway
ladder.
to
Ladder
to
up
heaven.
and down to heaven.
Oh,
I'm
that's-
sure he shared that with him, and
Sure.
Yeah, this is very early in biblical history. I mean, we're talking about Genesis, so
And we're,
Yeah.
We're still a dozen chapters from the end of Genesis,
yeah.
which is from here on out, Joseph. But,
Right.
So
Well-
it could cause some distress in the family knowing that the youngest son is the one that is having dreams, and daddy had dreams too.
Yeah.
yes.
Daddy had that, and nobody else through the years has said anything about it. And all of a sudden, here's the little whippersnapper come along.
Uh-huh.
He's going to cause some trouble just even saying that, because that makes him even more special because he's got a little something of dad going on there.
Yeah.
Yes. Yes. It
Jacob
just
and
affirms,
Esau.
Yeah.
it just affirms what dad's kind of highlighting. So this was kind of destined for problems, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Mhm.
Well, I have a couple of closing thoughts for you. One is that God doesn't play favorites. God doesn't have favorite children.
Yeah.
Well, all of us somewhat envy somebody. It's astounding how we do that. But God hasn't played favorites.
Amen.
And life circumstances do not reflect God's level of love for us. Too often we get caught in I'm having these problems. I must have done something wrong. God doesn't love me. That's not true. God loved Joseph down in the bottom of the cistern. God loved Joseph in prison in Egypt. So there's an old prayer that I suspect most of you have heard. I'd like to read a piece of it. It's the old breastplate of St. Patrick. And this is a portion of it. It's easily 5 times longer than this. But this is the portion that speaks to our lesson for today. Christ with me, Christ before me, Christ behind me, Christ in me, Christ beneath me, Christ above me, Christ on my right, Christ on my left, Christ when I lay down, Christ when I sit down, Christ when I arise, Christ in the heart of every man who thinks of me, Christ in the mouth of everyone who speaks of me, Christ in every eye that sees me, Christ in every ear that hears me. We are always abiding, resting in Christ, in God. God is always here. God is always present. God is with us in all things.
Amen.
My parting word for today. So God bless. Have a good one. Let's close with a word of prayer. Lord, thank you for the time to open your word. Help us to remember what it is to be near you. Help us to actively seek that. Help us to bring our prayers to you, even the prayers we might be a little afraid to speak, especially to you. Help us to seek people to share our lives with. And most of all, Lord God, help us to remember that in everything, at every time, and at every moment, you are with us, you are around us, and you hold us and sustain us. In the awesome name of Christ we pray. Amen.
Amen.
Thank you, Pastor.
Kevin.
Thank you. Thanks.
Seeing everybody.
Same time next week?
Yeah, are we looking to go? Are we